Hey everyone and welcome. I'm Locke. You can think of me as your guide for this deep dive. Like that friend who can't get enough of those fascinating biographies.
And I'm Demosthenes, happy to be joining you.
All right, let's dive into this. We're tackling a big one today. How do you actually succeed in the Chinese market? It's this huge economic powerhouse, obviously, but it's also, well, it's famous for being a tough nut to crack.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating case study in how global business works these days.
To get into it, we've got a ton of interesting sources. Articles from places like the BBC and New York Times, some reports straight from Chinese media.
Oh, and don't forget about the YouTube commentator at MSLFB.
Right, that's right. They provide a really interesting perspective on this whole landscape.
And the best part is we're not just theorizing here. We've got some real-world examples to really see how different things can play out.
Exactly. Like we're going to look at Tesla. They've basically become superstars in China.
And then Biontech, kind of a surprising stumble there.
And Moderna, which seems to be stuck in this, I don't know, bureaucratic maze, I guess you could say.
Yeah, by looking at these cases, we can start to get a handle on the nuances, the strategies, and yeah, the potential pitfalls.
For anyone trying to make it big in China.
It's like a high-stakes game. Big rewards, but the rules can be complicated.
So let's set the stage a bit. China's economic growth has been, well, phenomenal. And for foreign businesses, it's like this irresistible magnet.
For sure. But as we said, it's no walk in the park either. Regulations everywhere, cultural differences that can really trip you up.
And then you've got the Chinese companies themselves. They're not exactly slouches when it comes to competition.
Oh, absolutely not. Okay, are we ready for our first case study? Tesla.
Tesla, yeah. It's kind of hard to believe how fast they went from signing that agreement in 2018 to basically dominating sales in China.
It's pretty mind-blowing. They got their gigafactory in Shanghai up and running in less than a year. Shanghai Speed, they called it.
Shanghai Speed, yeah. And that wasn't all, was it? I mean, didn't the Chinese government basically roll out the red carpet for them?
Oh, big time. Huge incentives. Land at a crazy discount, a massive loan with a tiny interest rate. It was a big deal.
Wow, so that's some serious VIP treatment. But I'm guessing the Chinese government wasn't just handing out freebies, right? There had to be a strategy behind it.
Right. And what's often missed is that the Shanghai government put in some clever conditions to make sure they got something back from their investment. Specific targets for how much tax revenue Tesla had to generate, minimum investment requirements, and a big push for Tesla to source parts locally.
So it's like, we'll help you out, but you got to help us grow our own industries too.
Exactly. A win-win, at least in theory. And then you've got this concept called the Hsu, the catfish effect, which is all about shaking things up to stimulate competition.
The catfish effect, I like that. So how does that apply to Tesla?
Well, their presence basically forced Chinese EV companies to innovate and up their game, which ended up benefiting the whole EV market in China.
Gotcha. So Tesla was like this jolt of electricity, if you will.
Right.
Okay, so we've got amazing speed, massive incentives, a push for local sourcing. But, I mean, what about the elephant in the room, right? The Chinese bureaucracy. How do they manage that?
Well, connections are everything in China, and it seems like Tesla figured that out. They had support from some very powerful people like Li Keqiang, who was premier at the time, Li Teng, the Shanghai party secretary, and Li Feng, who was head of the National Development and Reform Commission.
Wow, those are some serious names.
Yeah, having those high-level connections definitely smoothed the way for Tesla.
So it's not just about having a great product. It's also about, well, knowing the right people and playing the game, I guess.
It definitely helps.
All right, so that's Tesla. They're kind of like a success story. But now let's look at Biontech, because they had a completely different experience, almost like a cautionary tale, right?
Yeah, it is really interesting how their story contrasts with Tesla's. I mean, they had this cutting-edge mRNA vaccine technology and even some initial support from Li Cheng, but they really struggled when it came to actually setting up manufacturing in Shanghai.
What happened there? Did they just, I don't know, did they miss the memo about connections?
It's a bit more complicated than that. BioNTech's mRNA technology was really groundbreaking, but it ran into some specific hurdles in China. For one thing, the Chinese vaccine market is dominated by state-controlled companies, so they were already facing stiff competition.
So it's almost like they were playing by a different set of rules.
Yeah, you could say that. And then there was the whole issue of technology transfer. The Chinese government wanted BioNTech to share their mRNA tech in exchange for access to the market, which BioNTech was pretty hesitant about, understandably.
Yeah, I can see why they'd be careful about that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the COVID situation threw a whole other wrench into things.
Oh, absolutely. The timing couldn't have been worse. China's zero COVID policy and then the sudden shift away from it created a really unpredictable situation.
So it sounds like they had the tech, some connections, but they ran into roadblocks that were more about the specific dynamics of the vaccine market and the overall political climate.
It really highlights the importance of understanding not just the general business landscape in China, but also the specific challenges of the industry you're operating in.
Right, so they were kind of playing a different game. Okay, so we've got Tesla, the success story, and Biontech, who faced a very different set of challenges.
Hmm.
And I think it's time to move on to our third case study, Moderna, who are still trying to figure all of this out, right?
Yeah, and Moderna's interesting because they announced plans for a manufacturing plant in Shanghai back in 2023, but things seem to have stalled since then.
Really? But didn't the Shanghai government say they were making it easier for foreign companies to invest, streamlining things?
They did, but it seems like Moderna is running into a different kind of problem. Unlike Tesla, who had direct access to top officials, Moderna is stuck dealing with lower-level government entities, specifically in the Minhang district.
So it's like they're waiting in line while the important decisions are happening somewhere else.
You got it. It shows that even though China's leaders might say, come invest, actually dealing with the bureaucracy can be a whole other story.
It reminds me of something I read about Bill Gates. He was trying to work on this nuclear power project in China, and it just got bogged down in delays, partly because of, well, bureaucratic stuff.
It sounds like Moderna might be in a similar situation. Lots of layers, different interests, and yeah, sometimes things just move really slowly.
So even with a game-changing product like Moderna's vaccines, you can still get stuck. It looks like connections are important, but they're not always enough, especially if you're in a sector that China considers, well, strategically sensitive.
That's a really crucial insight. It's not just about the product or the connections. You've got to understand the political context, the regulations, and have a strategy that can adapt to, well, how things are constantly changing in China.
And those things can change pretty quickly sometimes, it seems.
They absolutely can. Yeah, it really is a constantly moving target.
So let's talk about this He Lifeng character. Our sources make him sound like a pretty big deal for foreign companies trying to get into China.
Oh, he's definitely an important figure, a real power player. He's risen through the ranks, held some key positions in economic planning, and now he's a vice premier.
And some people even call him the, what was it, the gatekeeper.
That's right, the gatekeeper of China's economy. So yeah, if you're a foreign company, getting on his good side is probably a pretty good idea.
Okay, gatekeeper. That's a pretty intense title. So, I mean, what makes him so powerful?
Well, you have to remember, he's not just managing the economy, he's also responsible for making sure China's interests are protected on the global stage.
Right, because things are getting more and more, well, complicated out there. So it's not just about profits anymore for foreign companies. It's also about showing how they fit into China's long-term goals.
You got it, and that's a big shift. His role is different from the people who came before him.
So how is it different?
They were sometimes called barbarian handlers. I know, kind of a strange term.
Barbarian handlers. Wow, okay.
It reflects a different era, a different approach to foreign companies.
Right. So how does He Lifeng compare to those guys? I mean, we had Zhu Rongji, who brought China into the World Trade Organization.
And Zhu Xiaochuan, who was known for pushing market reform.
Right, so they were all about opening up, attracting foreign investment.
Lifing represents a shift in thinking. It's less about integrating with global markets and more about strengthening China itself.
More focused on China being secure and self-reliant.
Exactly, which has big implications for foreign businesses.
So it's a whole new ballgame, even for companies that have been operating in China for a while.
Yeah, playing by the rules means something different now. It's not enough to just offer a good product or service. You've got to show that you're actually helping China in the long run.
You can't threaten those core industries.
Exactly. And Lifen's background plays into this.
How so?
Well, he's known for being loyal to President Xi Jinping, worked with him early on, and he spent years in the National Development and Reform Commission, so he really knows the system.
So he's not exactly someone who spends his time, I don't know, hanging out with Western CEOs.
Not really, no. And some Western executives who have met him describe him as a tough negotiator. He's there to lay down the official line, not necessarily have this open dialogue.
Okay, so let's go back to Tesla for a second. They seem to have figured things out, but was it all just because they got special treatment? I mean, our sources suggest they have a lot of high-level support, benefited from policies that other companies couldn't access.
That's a good point, and it's something people debate a lot. Tesla definitely had some unique advantages. They were the first foreign car company allowed to have a wholly owned factory in China. Usually you have to partner with a Chinese company in a joint venture.
And that sweetheart deal on land and financing in Shanghai.
Right, that was definitely helped by people like Li Qiang, who was running Shanghai at the time.
It makes you wonder, is Tesla's success even something other companies can replicate? Or was it just a unique situation?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Connections are important, but it's also about timing, strategy, maybe even a little luck.
Like being in the right place at the right time with the right product, right?
Yeah. And speaking of timing, Biontech's experience really shows how things can go wrong, even if you do have those connections.
It's like they walked right into a buzzsaw, right? China being sensitive about vaccines, the market already being controlled by state-owned companies, and then the sudden change in the COVID policy. Just bad luck, I guess.
You could say that. It just shows that even with the right introductions, success in China is never guaranteed. You can't just assume things will go smoothly.
And then you've got Moderna, still stuck in that bureaucratic maze we were talking about.
Moderna's story really highlights how tricky it can be to deal with those lower-level government entities, even if the top leaders are saying all the right things.
It's like Tesla got to go straight to the CEO's office, while Moderna is stuck talking to middle management.
It's a great analogy. Access to the top decision makers is so important, but it's often really hard to get, especially if you're in an industry Beijing sees as strategically important. They want to control those.
Which makes me wonder, is China becoming more selective about who they let in? Is it less of an open door and more of a, I don't know, a more calculated approach?
That's a really interesting question, and it does seem like things are shifting. It's not the open door policy of the past anymore. It's more strategic, more deliberate.
Okay, so for someone listening who's thinking about doing business in China, what's the takeaway? Should they go for it or be really careful?
Well, these case studies show that it's complicated. There's no easy answer, but there are some important lessons to keep in mind.
Let's break it down.
First, China isn't one big homogenous market. Different industries, different regions, even different levels of government, they all operate differently.
So doing your research is more important than ever.
Absolutely. Second, connections are still vital, but they're not everything. You need to really understand the political landscape, the regulations, and have a plan that fits with what China wants to achieve.
And third, patience.
Oh yeah, patience is key. Building trust, navigating the bureaucracy, it all takes time.
So it's not a place for quick wins.
No, it's about long-term commitment, being willing to adapt to changes.
But if you do it right, the payoff can be huge.
Exactly, and I think the stories of Tesla, Biontech, and Moderna give us a lot to think about as we try to figure out how to succeed in China.
And speaking of Tesla, it's interesting how their entry into China really changed the power dynamics in the electric vehicle industry. It's really wild how things have shifted.
Totally. I mean, for decades, it was the Western companies dominating the car industry. They controlled everything, the engines, the transmissions, the whole supply chain.
You had those big names, right? Bosch, Aisin, Denso. They were the kings of the combustion engine era.
Exactly. But Tesla's sourcing parts locally in China, combined with China's manufacturing power, it's a whole new game now.
It is. Now you've got these Chinese companies like CATL, Zhusheng, Tuopu Group. They're becoming major players, supplying parts for Tesla factories, even outside of China.
Yeah, the balance of power is definitely shifting, and that's having a ripple effect throughout the entire industry.
Pretty fascinating to watch, actually. So for companies thinking about China, it's not just competing with Chinese companies there.
Yeah.
It's understanding how everything is connected, right?
Exactly. You're not just entering a market, you're stepping into this whole system of relationships, regulations, long-term plans.
So like, I don't know, 4D chess or something. So let's bring it all back to our original question, right? What does it take to actually succeed in China?
Well, we've seen how Tesla did it, using government connections, navigating the regulations, adapting to the market.
But then you've got companies like Biontech and Moderna. They struggled even with their amazing technology.
And I think those different experiences show us just how important it is to really understand what's happening in China.
It's not like there's one magic formula that works for everyone.
Nope. What works for one company could be a disaster for another.
So much depends on timing, the specific industry, the political situation. It's complicated.
It really is.
So any final words of wisdom for our listeners out there?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is that China still has huge potential, but it's not the Wild West anymore. Success takes more than just a great product. It takes planning, partnerships, and really understanding the rules of the game, both the written ones and the unspoken ones.
Right, because those unwritten rules, those can be the trickiest. And they're always changing too, aren't they?
That's the thing. China's a dynamic, complex place. The companies that can adapt, learn, build relationships, they're the ones who will make it.
It's like surfing.
Surfing.
Yeah, you got to be quick, read the waves, and have a board that can handle anything.
That's a great way to put it. And just like surfing, sometimes you catch the perfect wave, sometimes you wipe out. That's business in China.
Well, folks, that wraps up our deep dive into doing business in China. We've looked at the good, the bad, and the lessons learned from companies like Tesla, Biontech, and Moderna.
Hopefully, this gives you something to think about as you navigate the global business world.
And one last thought before we go. As China keeps rising, how will doing business there change? Will it become easier, more predictable, or maybe even more challenging?
That's the big question, isn't it? Only time will tell. But one thing's for sure, understanding what's happening in China is going to be absolutely crucial for anyone who wants to succeed in the 21st century.
So keep learning, keep adapting, and stay curious, because when it comes to business, especially with China, it's never boring.